less interested in Greg's, but I find Greg's very interesting. And I'm also not sure if this fits in very neatly into the theme of this particular seminar room. So I'm going to go through, I suppose, I'll call this maybe a little wake-up call. So it's not really a terribly academic presentation, it's more a general, maybe a little alarm bell about where we might be going with regulation in the building process. Let's start with why do we have regulation in the building process at all? I think we're all aware of why we do. We need to control where buildings can be put. We need appropriate design standards for all sectors. We need safety in construction and safety in use. We need accessibility for people of all different abilities. We need to minimize energy use and pollution. We need to ensure that public health is protected by making sure our sewage is properly dealt with. We need to provide roads and infrastructures, and we need to protect public amenities and the landscape. So that's all pretty sort of straightforward. There is complexity, though, in the way this has evolved, and the complexity falls under two sort of headings. The volume of regulations we have to deal with as professionals in particular, and the difficulty in understanding some of the things we're being called on to understand. So this isn't a criticism of where we've got to. I think where we've got to is where most countries that are trying to evolve a robust system of standards and regulation have got to. And it's almost inevitable that when you start piling layer upon layer upon layer, that the complexity grows unintendedly or unintentionally. If you look at where we started with legislation, I think the first, as far as I know, the first attempt to regulate building standards was in the late 19th century when we had the Public Health Act which led to building bylaws, which I'm old enough to remember. Then we had the Planning Development Act of '63, which was the first attempt to really control how the environment, in terms of visual environment, is affected by building. Then the Fire Services Act happened after the terrible Stardust tragedy. Then we had the Building Control Act of 1990 and the Building Regulations. So we're all familiar with those. And then from 2000, we've had another 9 sets of primary legislation, which again we're all probably familiar with. So these are the principal acts. But those acts in turn then give rise to a series of statutory instruments. And in the last 6 years, we've had that page and that page of statutory instruments. And we all have to be conversant with these to a large extent, because failure to take cognizance of what they require us to do is obviously a problem. And then we have the technical guidance documents, which were brought in to help translate the objectives of the building regulations into something that we as professionals and as construction activists could actually do. So they came in, and very helpfully there were books that helped the practitioners understand them. But all of those then referred in turn to a series of Irish standards and British standards and some codes of practice. In Part A, there was nearly 40. Part B was that page, and that page, which is over 100 additional standards, British and Irish, that we had to follow. All in all, there are effectively 13 technical guidance documents, because there are 2 Part Ls. And there are nearly 500 standards of documents referenced in those documents. So you can see how the thing starts to grow. So when you look at the acts, the statutory instruments, the TGDs, the Irish standards, British standards, various development plans and SDZs and LAPs and codes of practice, we have conservatively 650 documents that we are meant to be conversant with. That's problematic, I think, because I have a medium-sized practice, there's 15 of us, and I think I probably should have one of those whose only job it is to keep up with evolving regulation, directives, etc. And that's not practical. This is a comment. As we drive towards the utopia of having no bad outcomes from producing buildings. It's becoming an imperative in developing more and more complex regulations. No one should ever be able to fall, etc. We need to accept as a society that the benefits of a child running around a school playground outweigh the risks that he or she might fall and cut their knee or break their arm. So this notion that we can have 100% perfect buildings is deeply flawed, and I think it's something that is happening across a number of sectors. Perfect is the enemy of good in this particular case. I'll pick the UK as an example because it's also been aware of this ever-growing complexity. And they set up a thing called the Red Tape Challenge. A comment from that report was that the housing and construction industries are key to driving growth in our economy. Through smarter regulation, we can remove barriers to growth and encourage investment, choice and innovation. Greg's talk on innovation there is an important part of this conversation. The RIBA also expressed deep concern about how the regulations have gone from something that were based on a simple objective to something that's become very complex. The UK government, in a report in response to the various concerns, have acknowledged that the complexity of guidance has to be considered to be beyond the understanding of many. Now, if the guidance is beyond the understanding of those who are meant to implement it, an alarm bell should ring. So let's look at what would happen if we took some of the approaches that we take in building regulation to, say, speed limits. Here's potential calculation. If you take the mass of a car and the number of people in the car and the average weight of those people and the tread depth and the weather scale and the road surface and how much brake pad is left in your car, and you come up with a calculation, something like that, which might be familiar to those of you who know Part L, you probably won't get it right. So what we do instead is we follow that model, which is the simple 30 kilometers per hour limit. That maybe should be 32, maybe it should be 28, depends on the day, depends on how tired you are. But we accept the fact that an approximation here is better than making a mistake in a complex calculation. The consequences of this dual complexity of building regulation, and I'm not talking about the building regulations themselves, I'm talking about regulation generally in the building procurement, is the rapid rise in specialization. That's almost now unstoppable, and I'd question whether it's a good thing, especially for smaller projects. The associated costs in time and in money and particularly affecting house buildings is something that should concern us. And there will be a tipping point in compliance, which if we pass will reduce the incidence of compliance, not improve it. And that's been shown internationally. Compliance levels grow until it reaches a stage where people can't really understand what they're meant to be doing, and then compliance levels drop again. It also leads to a defensive approach to complying with regulations, and that leads to higher transaction costs in time and money. Competitiveness is affected. I think the World Bank did a survey of countries where they have what they consider transactional impediments to building, and we scored very badly in that. The risk of litigation is increased. The ability to introduce real improvements are compromised because of the wood from the trees syndrome. There's so much regulation there that when we need to bring in a very important element of regulation, it's sort of lost in the mass of the other regulations that are hitting us. And there's also a barrier to entry to the sector because of the complexities involved and the fear that drives. SMEs are particularly badly affected. And SI9 is in danger of becoming a monster in relation to the number of ancillary certificates that some people think are required. I'm familiar with one fit-out project which wasn't a primary building project, and there was 350 ancillary certificates required for it. So that level of over-the-top paperwork is a problem. Possible measures, I don't have solutions. If I did, I probably wouldn't be standing up here. It'd be somewhere more, where I might be able to write something more useful. But I do believe, and the institute of which I'm the honorary secretary of also believes, that there should be a national body set up to examine measures as to how to streamline all the processes, planning, building regulations, all of those processes that we have to follow. And it should also be able to quickly adjudicate in specific cases where interpretation is difficult. And we should try as much as possible to standardise all the forms we have to use and not have a different form done in Kerry to the one in County Louth. Maybe we should pause updating the regulations for a while, unless there's something that's absolutely essential for health and safety. A pause would help provide time for review. There are already ACDs on the department's website which are very useful, but maybe they could be consolidated into more usable books that cover more than Part L of the regulations. I think we should revisit a lot of the current regulations to see where there are conflicts and where they might be consolidated. It would be good to analyse the cost of regulations on housing and FDI. And a little bugbear of mine is the Civil Liabilities Act really does need to be reviewed, which is not for today or for the next year or possibly 10 years, so that the kid running around the playground falling doesn't lead to another regulation that will ban children running altogether. So that's sort of my little rant for the afternoon. Thanks very much.